Welcome to the Fighting on Film podcast, the podcast all about classic and obscure war movies, from the Normandy landings to the days of chivalry and swords. If it's been captured on film, we're going to try and cover it. I'm Robbie of RM Military History.
I'm Matthew Moss of Historical Firearms and the Armourer's Bench.
Hello, welcome back to the FOF Pod. Now, this week's film is Merril's Marauders, which was chosen by our Patreons in July's film vote that we hold every month over on our Patreon page. Now, if you want to join in the fun and keep the mics on here at the FOF HQ, then please do have a look at our Patreon tiers that start from little as £2.50 per month. Now, this week's guest is no stranger to the show, having joined us in Anzac Month for Attack Force C. It is, of course, Gavin Mortimer, whose book, Merril's Marauders, The Untold Story of Unit Galahad and the Toughest Special Forces Mission of World War II. He's perfect to join us for this film. Gavin, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here. Good to be back and looking forward to talking about the Marauders and particularly this film, which it's fair to say didn't go down that well with the Marauder, certainly the veterans I spoke to.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to getting into that. And there are a couple of Patreon questions that will be coming up later on in the show. So, Matt, would you like to talk about the cast first and then we can go into production?
Well, I mean, starting off, we got to mention that this is Jeff Chandler's last film, and he is the eponymous Merril in the movie. He'd been in a number of films before, made his name actually as Cochise in Broken Arrow, and he played Cochise a couple of times in his career. Did lots of westerns, lots of romantic comedies, etc. And then a couple of war movies, including Away All Boats in 1956, The Red Ball Express, about the logistics of moving things up from the beaches on D-Day, and The Yankee Buccaneer, which is a bit of a naval adventure set in the 1830s, I think. And tragically, in 1961, not too long after production ended on the movie, he went and had some back surgery and died as a result of apparently malpractice. The operation on his spinal cord, I think he had a slip disc or something like that, and it went wrong, and he had perhaps about 70 pints of blood during a couple of operations to try and save him, and he got blood poisoning and died sadly at that, almost at the height of his fame.
Sam, in his biography, The Third Face, says, I thought it was going to usher in this new age for Jeff, and it isn't. It's his last movie, and he says, I always feel awful for that. He almost blames himself in a way. It's quite sad, isn't it?
You sent me that, and I read it, and I thought it was interesting. It talks about him being a very physical guy anyway. He was playing football between takes, never complained about his back on set while they were filming it, and it looked like a fairly demanding film, moving a lot across some fairly difficult terrain, walking through water. That takes a toll on someone in heat, doesn't it? I think it was filmed in the Philippines. Is that right, Rob?
Yeah,
it was. Yeah.
So to not complain during that kind of grueling filming is one thing, and then to just have a terrible surgery and then die in such an
I think it adds to way, really. It adds to the characterization, because I know that he was reportedly feeling ill and had this back pain on set.
Well, the limp, I always think see him with that limp throughout the film. I'm sure Gavin will talk more about that, about Merril's actual health. Yeah.
Well, that's right, because of course Merril died. We see that in the film, and Merril died, I think, in the early 50s of his weak heart. So there's a sort of rather eerie parallel between the two. Fact and fiction.
Yeah.
So the other lead in there is Ty Hardin, another interesting character, and he plays Second Lieutenant Stockton, who apparently has the entire throughout the entire film was the point platoon for the Marauders throughout the whole campaign, and single-handedly took I think it was what's the first battle in that film during that first main battle sequence in the film, they detail a battalion to knock out the fuel dump, and then just Stock's platoon does the whole operation. You don't see anyone else doing it. It's just Stock's platoon goes all the way through. But so I mean, Ty Hardin, perhaps his most prominent war movie role outside of this is Lieutenant Schumacher in Battle of the Bulge, where he plays that fifth columnist.
Yeah. Oh, is that blimey? Yeah.
Yeah.
I forgot that he was in that. I
Korean War vet.
Film from my memory.
Lots of westerns. It's not that. PT 109 in 1963. And then, as we mentioned before the show, he famously went on to found the anti-tax movement, the Arizona Patriots.
Yeah.
Quite the character.
Yeah, wow.
He died only 2017.
2017.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Oh, Gavin was telling me all about that anti-tax thing before we started. I couldn't believe it.
Well, no one likes paying tax, but
Well,
I mean,
no,
I've never started a movement to prevent it.
No, that's what I mean. Yeah.
That's a lovely name, the Arizona Patriots. I mean, when I first heard it, I was sure that was an NFL team.
Yeah, I was about to say that. It sounds
sort of, really,
spot on, doesn't it? And then just to round out the rest of the cast, we got Peter Brown as Bullseye. His other major war movie credit was Darby's Rangers in 1958 with James Garner. Andrew Duggan played the Doctor, Captain Collandy. He was in a lot of westerns, and I mean a lot of westerns. Will Hutchinson played Chowhound. Again, another actor with a lot of small roles in westerns. He was also in Bombers B-52 in 1957, and the World War One American pilots movie Lafayette Esquadrille in 1958 as well. And then we've got Claude Atkins, who was Kolowitz, the sergeant of the platoon, and he was an actual veteran of the U.S. Army Signal Corps in Burma and the Philippines, apparently. And he was in From Here to Eternity, The Caine Mutiny, The Raid, and played Rocky Rockman in the Devil's Brigade in 1968 as well. Who else have we got? We got Pancho Malonga, Magalona, I think it is. Pancho Magalona, who plays Tangi, the anachronistic Filipino translator, who I know Gavin is going to talk about a little bit later on. He was quite a well-known Filipino actor, and he appeared in Cavalry Command in 1958. The Hook, a Korean War movie with Kirk Douglas, which I haven't seen and need to look up.
Oh, nice. And
then he was also, I found quite interestingly, he was in A Yankee in Vietnam, which is, I think, one of the, if not the first, one of the first US Vietnam War films. I know, Gavin, you mentioned earlier there was a lot of controversy around that. Do you want to talk about that now or later on?
Firstly, just to say that what's interesting is, of the cast, there were three characters, three real-life characters. So you had Merril, General Stilwell, and then you had the Doctor, who you mentioned, Doc Kolodny, which is interesting. I mean, I don't know, Merril and Stilwell, yeah, of course, you know, they're the sort of the main protagonists of a Marauders story. But why they had that Doctor? Because there were about, how many years? I think there were 6 Doctors in total in the Marauders. And this one was wasn't a stand-up Doctor, but whether he was a friend of someone or I don't know. But anyway, that's just quite interesting that there were 3 real-life characters. So yeah, going back to this whole Filipino business, and I tweeted about this today with a link to the discussion now, that caused some deep offence at the time when the film came out in 1961, and which was still there in 2013. That's when I interviewed Roy Matsumoto, who was one of the 14 Japanese-American Nisei interpreters. Now, Roy is one of the most remarkable men I ever had the privilege to meet. He was born in California, and then when he was about 12, he was sent to Japan, to Hiroshima, would you believe, where his family was from originally. And he spent his adolescence in there, didn't like it. As soon as he was 18, came back to the States. So now we're talking 1931, the Depression, got a job as a grocer's assistant, delivering for a family member. So delivering groceries to mainly the Japanese community in California, which proved to be vital because there he came across lots of different Japanese accents. So he got the ear for picking up, like with us, Brummies, Scousers, Cockneys, whatever, West Countrymen. So,
yeah, of course, yeah.
War broke out.
Lots of variation.
He was deemed, along with thousands of other Japanese Americans, an enemy alien. He was interned in January 1942. 6 months he was interned. And then it suddenly dawned on the Americans that they here was a great untapped resource. Never mind that they treated them so abominably, but they needed interpreters. So Roy volunteered for, I think it was the American Intelligence Service, trained as an interpreter, and then he volunteered for that. And then he volunteered for the Marauders in September 43. And in Burma with the Marauders, what he did was extraordinary. There's a moment in the film where you see Tangi climbing up to tap into a phone wire. That actually happened. That was Roy. He spent the whole day doing it. He put a little sort of like an alligator clip, and he was able to listen in to the 18th Division, and they actually said, we are going to attack the Americans from their one of their flanks. So he was able to climb down, tell them that, and the Marauders were waiting for them, wipe them out. At the siege of Naponga, which was a 2-week siege involving the 2nd Battalion, which was Roy's battalion, what he actually did was he would climb out of his foxhole at night, crawl to within about 6 feet of a Japanese position. Now, bear in mind, Roy told me, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. It was that dark. He would just listen in to the Japanese giving instructions. And they, because the Japanese, of course, didn't think that they were sort of loud whispers. They didn't think the Marauders could. And then they did this. And on one night, he crawled back to Ted McLaughlin, who was his commanding officer, and he said, they're going to attack at 0600 hours, and they're going to attack the right-hand side of where they were besieged, dug in this hillside. So again, they were waiting for them. The Japanese attacked, and they just wiped out the first wave. Second wave sort of faltered. They saw what happened to the first wave, and Roy shouted out in perfect Japanese the commands, the right commands: advance, keep going. And so the second wave faltered, but then kept going, and they were wiped out too. So that's
incredible.
Roy Matsumoto for you. And
you see Tangi, like at the very end of the movie, he does do that, doesn't he? Goes into no man's land and listens in and says there's going to be a banzai attack.
So I asked Roy when I interviewed him. I said, "What did you think of the film when it came out?" And he just said, "No comment."
Oh.
And then his daughter sent me, a lovely woman, Karen, sent me an email saying, and I quote now, "Our family was shocked. The character who portrayed Roy was replaced by a Filipino mercenary who just happened to speak Japanese. It appeared Hollywood was unable or unwilling to have a Japanese American as a hero," which I think is appalling, because and the Marauders were outraged too, because they still, when I interviewed about a dozen of them, they held the Nisai in absolute awe, because as one said to me, we knew what had happened to us if we were caught by the Japanese. Imagine what they would do if they caught one of the Nisai. Yet they volunteered and they performed just with extraordinary, not only efficiency, but courage.
It's so weird, isn't it? Because they had Go for Broke in the 50s.
Yeah.
Which is a direct depiction of a very highly decorated Japanese unit. And then probably just under 10 years later, they aren't able to do that, have a singular Japanese American character that played such a large role and did so many, courageous things. And, it boggles the mind a little bit, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
Well, it might be Fuller's doing, because he says in his autobiography that he was able to choose the cast, or whether it's a thing from up high. It just goes, you have to have this guy in, or I felt like it was so they could just mention Bataan, like because they talked to him about.
He does mention it a number of times, doesn't he?
Because he says to him to tuck in his uniform, in his jacket, and he goes, "Oh, I wasn't dirty enough when I came back from the Philippines. I wasn't dirty enough when I travelled across the ocean to come and join your army." It's like, it's like, "Oh, I'm doing you a favour here," and I was like, "Oh, is it just so they can mention?" Those,
perhaps so. I mean,
it was filmed in the Philippines, wasn't it? Was there some deal done with filming the Philippines? If you have a Filipino as one of the heroes.
Well, I mean, why couldn't they have had both?
Exactly,
they could have easily had both.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just to round out cast before we move on to production, an interesting one is a cameo by Samuel Vaughan Wilson, who was actually a lieutenant general in the US Army. And he had been the chief reconnaissance officer of the 53007th.
Yeah.
And he was the technical advisor on the film, which I think is really interesting. Now, as you said earlier, Gavin, I wonder if the doctor character was perhaps suggested by Wilson as, oh, well, that was one of the doctors, perhaps he was a friend, and that's why he was chosen out of the 6 or so doctors that were actually, there, and he was a named character. I don't know, but I thought that was really interesting that the technical advisor who was actually there got a cameo.
Yeah, I interviewed Sam Wilson, General Sam, who died in 2017. As you say, he was a 20-year-old platoon commander at the time. Turned out to be one of the top Marauders. I mean, he had this very distinguished career. A high rank. He actually coined the phrase counterinsurgency. High-ranking CIA officer.
I read a little bit of his bio, and he seemed like quite the man.
Leading force in Delta Force in establishing it, but really intelligent. People listening to this will probably think, they can imagine this sort of big cigar chewing crew cut American. Not at all. He was a very, very. He was the dean in his final years of quite a well-known liberal. I could get this wrong. Is it Hartford? I think a well-known liberal arts university. He was a really open-minded guy. When I talked to him, I was a bit apprehensive beforehand, but we had this long 2-hour conversation, and he was just an extraordinary man. And in fact, there's a question that one of the viewers has asked about Stilwell. I'm going to, in answering that, I'm going to quote what Wilson told me when I spoke to him, which is interesting. But Wilson also, really honest man, very intellectually courageous and open-minded, but he had some very, very strong things to say about Merril and the second in command, who's completely omitted from the film, Charles Hunter, who was really the driving force behind the Marauders.
Wow,
fascinating!
It's amazing. Well, I won't mention Sam in my production notes now because I don't think mine are going to be as good as that. So the production. It's a Warner Brothers production, and it was pitched to Sam Fuller, the film's director, as a, quote, dry run for his passion project, which would be the Big Red One. Obviously, he served with the Big Red One in the Second World War, combat veteran, served in Africa, served in Normandy. He helped liberate Frankenau concentration camp as well. He filmed footage of the liberation of that camp, and it was used in a French documentary about the camp. Fuller obviously goes on to direct The Steel Helmet and Fixed Bayonets, being Korean War movies. He gets a Bronze Star during his service, a Combat Infantryman's Badge, Purple Heart. The movie was also co-written by Fuller and Milton Sperling, who serves as the film's producer. His credits include Battle of the Bulge and Retreat Hell, and 2 wartime documentaries, Battle of the Marianas in 1944 and To the Shores of Iwo Jima in 1945. And William H. Clothier acted as the film's cinematographer. He was a veteran of the United States Army Air Force, and he flew in B-17s. And his credits include For Whom the Bell Tolls, Memphis Belle, that was directed by William Wellman, and The Alamo, John Wayne, and The Devil's Brigade. The film's score was composed by Howard Jackson, and he also uses parts of the score from Objective Burma. However, the composer for that one is uncredited. It premiered on the 29th of May in New York City and in the UK on the 14th of July 1962. As we mentioned earlier, the film is filmed in location on the Philippines, and they had a production headquarters set up at Clark Air Base, and over 1,000 Filipino soldiers served as the film's extras. The film's budget was reportedly over $1 million, and according to Fuller in his memoir, Third Face, the movie made apparently $18 million back. Now, that's incredible for 1962, if that's the case. It's a big box office take. And for that, Jack Warner bought Sam Fuller a car of his choice. And he's, after lots of thinking, apparently Fuller chose a Cadillac. So that was was nice for Sam. And the review this week comes from, it's a very obscure one, this paper this week. I don't think we've had a a paper that's not a well-known one for a while. It's from the Lewisham Borough News from the 24th of July, 1962. So Merrill's Marauders, stirring melodrama based on the exploits of the American Army units in Burma jungle in World War II. This film, tense, exciting, and finely photographed in Technicolor, is the authentic, I mean, we'll find out, won't we, from Gavin, story of the men known as Merrill's Marauders. It comes over as probably the best war picture for some years. Interesting. Yeah, I don't know if I fully agree with that statement, but it was a good little roundup there.
You want me to just read out some of the reviews that the Marauders
Please do. I think that would be a great way of offsetting that.
They'd made their reservations known at the annual reunion, but Warner Brothers, quote, had assured the Marauders they would like what they saw. It's interesting, yeah, because when it was released, the New York Times described it as a war drama of individuality and merit. Ted McLaughlin, who I mentioned earlier, who was a platoon leader, described it as just terrible, shoot-it-up stuff. It didn't develop character. It was based on Merril. Rob Passanizzi described it as, quote, pure Hollywood, utterly unrealistic. And but I mentioned what Roy Matsumoto said of it, which is interesting because, as Matt said earlier, with Sam Wilson as a technical advisor. However, you know, it's one thing being a technical advisor, how much influence he has. The uniforms were certainly quite. The uniforms and the weapons, from what I saw, I was looking through my photos today. I never saw them. They're in the film. They're festooned with grenades, like Christmas tree and baubles. But in the photos I was looking for through today, I couldn't see any of that. Headgear is very realistic. They wore a lot of whatever they fancied, really. Helmets, sort of sun hats, the cloth caps. In terms of actual terrain, it's not really realistic. There's a lot. They were very in Burma, very thick, tall elephant grass, 8-10 feet long. Other times they were, in fact, funny enough, it was Sam Wilson who was telling me once when he spent a day hacking through a bamboo jungle, and he just said it was the worst day of my life. It was just thick with stuff. It was so thick, and you just had to chop at it. Then the scene where they're going up the mountain, the Kumon mountain, where in the film it's sort of a zigzag and they're sort of pressed against the edge. Nothing like that at all. That was actually very muddy, very foggy, and actually up top it was freezing. And again, Sam Wilson said, I remember up top we're all huddled together and we were listening to the radio, trying to pick up the radio on the top of the mountain. So, but again, you know, you're limited if you film in the Philippines. That's that's what you're going to get. But I think it was interesting. I mean, the 2IC, Charles Hunter, who I mentioned earlier, was so disgusted with the film, he's not even mentioned, that he wrote his own memoirs a couple of years later, which unfortunately he allowed his bitterness to get the better of him. He was shipped back at the end of the mission. He was shipped back, not flown back. So by the time he landed in America, Stilwell and Merril would have had the chance to put their side of the story. There's a lot of controversy about what happened, because in the film we see Merril soldiering on, and the tough guy, no, absolutely not. He did have a heart attack on March the 28th, and then really for the next month he was out of the picture, and it was Hunter who led them really on the climax, the siege at Naponga, and then over the Kumon Mountains, the taking of Myitkyina. Stilwell flew into Myitkyina, I think on about the 19th of May, promptly had another heart attack and was shipped back was flown off to India. So it's not how Merril is portrayed in the film is not the reality.
That's fascinating.
That really is. Brings us on to our one-word reviews this week, The Return, after I think we've got a few weeks off of it. So Robert Lyman, big names on the one-word review this week. We had, it's not a one word, but it was good. So I'm going to stick it in. He said there were more Americans in SEAC than Brits, 277,000 versus 100,000. He said it's not one word, but hey, I like that. I think that refers back to maybe our Objective Burma episode with James Holland that we did, because there was a big controversy around that. And I noticed in this film, they go at pains to mention how many Commonwealth and British troops were involved in the Burma campaign. They don't make the same mistake twice.
I mean, it is interesting because in that intro, which is really good, I'm sure we'll talk about it later. It's quite a good intro, actually. They are at pains to name every part of the UK. Like they talk about Wales, Scotland, and England, and it's just like they're painfully trying to make Americans alongside all of these other people.
It must be Jack Warner's experience of doing Objective Burma and the fallout of that. It must be.
Well, maybe so. And then all we get is about five guys walk past in not great you British kit.
Yeah, it's not
and the officer's clearly not British. But I mean, carry on, Rob.
No, it's all right. It's fine. Then we had World War II TV's Paul Woodage. He says Fuller-esque, and we know he's a big Fuller fan. I think Big Red One's one of his favourite movies. If I remember talking to him about that once. He's right. I think it is Fuller-esque. And then we have one more. Simon Whippet said sweaty, and I think that probably sums up the feeling there. I mean, without further ado, I think that probably brings us on to the alley tally this week.
It's time for Alley Tally on Fighting on Film.
So, Gavin, as our guest, you've extensively researched this period and this theatre and the chaps that fought there. Something that the movie does well in terms of representing Merrill's Marauders.
Yeah, I think I'm going to talk about this in the favourite scene with the mules, the bond between man and animal. That was done quite well, and there is undoubtedly. I just mentioned about how it is really Hunter in reality and Merril in the film. But what did happen was because the reason for the source of the Marauders' angst, which sort of nearly simmered over into mutiny later on in the campaign, that they were continually promised this was going to be the last mission. And after the siege at Naponga, which ended, I think, Easter Sunday, so it was about April the 9th, 1944, that they thought that was it. And then they were told, no, we're going to push on to take the airstrip at Myitkyina, going over the 6,500 foot Kumon Pass. And then when they were told that when they got to Myitkyina airstrip, they'll be flown off to India, that would be it. But no, they spent 3 months hugging at the airfield. So that was just a quick explanation of why the sort of a disgruntlement. But we do see in the film the worry that that Merril has about pushing his men on when they're already sick. And again, that is touched on, the diseases. And for me, this is why the Marauders were such an exceptional, even among the special forces. I've written about the SAS, the SBS, the Long Range Desert Group. And as magnificent as they were, they didn't have to contend with debilitating diseases, so malaria, dysentery. I mean, some of the Marauders telling me that they cut the seats out of their trousers so that when they
like the Australians at Kokoda.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, I think it was quite a common thing. Scrub typhus, which killed quite a lot of Marauders, and just some of the men telling me, just saying to me, I can't convey what it was like when you've got malaria or dysentery or scrub typhus, which is peculiar to the jungle, and your temperature's about 104, your head thinks you're going to explode. It was always at the back of your mind. An ambush by the Japanese, and you've just got to keep going. And I think that's why I have such admiration for the Marauders. And that is touched on in the film. So we see that before the final scene when they go to Myitkyina, that is conveyed, that sort of bit. And while it was Hunter really in that position, not Merril, nonetheless, I think that's good, the way that they've done it, just to say the men were at that sort of at the end of their tether, but they had to keep going.
Yeah, there's one I do. That's one thing the film does. I did well. I think it does show you the strain on the men. It takes quite a while for them to look weathered and strained, but when they do, it is done quite well. And I like the scene where they have that really sort of delirious, almost out of hunger argument about food. I quite like that bit too. That was really nice. I think that's one of the stronger points of the movie when it turns its thoughts less about battles and Merrill's sort of, is he going to make it? Is he going to push these men too hard? When it actually shows you how the men are feeling and the strain put upon them, I do like that.
I think that's really important. It's a good point, Rob, because I think it was a battle because their engagements with the Japanese were few, but they were and short when they happened, but pretty violent, pretty savage. But really, in a way, and this was very much what I felt interviewing the Marauders, that it was a battle just as much against the environment, and whether that's disease or whether that's the bamboo, the elephant grass. Don't forget there were some pretty nasty snakes out there, and some of the boys were telling me, you don't want to. The last thing you want to see is a python when you're knackered, or a cobra, etc. So there's all these things sort of playing on your mind, I think. And if you compare that, say, to the North African campaign, when it's a very clean environment, no disease really, the odd viper in the desert, but it's just you again. It's just the Germans, the Axis forces. Whereas here, that's right. It's psychologically, I think, it's much more demanding of the men.
Yeah, because that's something that the Beach Red, if you've seen that, that really gets the psychological element quite. Goes into quite some detail there. Matt, is there anything you want to pick out this week?
Yeah, in terms of equipment and stuff, as Gavin said near the beginning of the show, like they get the uniform and the aesthetic, quite on point. There's the sergeant with the M1928 A1, and I like the part in I think it's the opening engagement where they're on a bank and the Japanese are coming over the top. And he's firing his Thompson, and he either, he has a jam or he runs out of ammunition. And Stock gives him his carbine. He says, "Use mine," and then Stock goes to his pistol, and that's nice. That's a nice little touch. I think the weapons handling in this film in general is actually really interesting because it is Fuller-esque, as we said. Those set pieces are really well done. They're a little bit they're very choreographed for this period.
Yes,
you can see it. Especially with that sequence where they're attacking the fuel dump. And I think it's Bullseye says, "Stock, let me have that hot one." And they throw a grenade that's had the pin pulled and the safety levers, gone. And they throw a grenade through like 3 men before he throws a group of Japanese that are approaching.
It is it's like Commando book Warlord.
It is. It
stuff.
is. It totally is. And I suppose it's interesting the way those 3 battles punctuate the film's 3 acts. You open up with that introduction of Stock and his men being shown as highly capable. They're the lead platoon, they're the vanguard, and then they're set in to do the mission anyway. So I said before we began recording, I think, and the beginning of that first battle sequence, Merril discusses which battalion's going to do what objective. And then when the actual sequence is shown, it's just Stock's platoon that goes straight through and knocks out the ammo dump and does everything basically. I quite liked the use of 57mm anti-tank guns as the Japanese artillery. I thought that was funny.
Cool. Nice little touch.
Yeah,
nice little,
and
60s war movie tropes there.
Yeah, exactly.
No one's
and
got
then
the right artillery and all things like that.
Those American 105s that are in every war movie in the 60s.
I assume this is what the Filipino army are using at the time.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, I think the other interesting thing is that a lot of the small arms in the movie are correct. So you not only see M1919A4s, the air cooled, but you also see the water cooled, which Gavin posted a photograph on Twitter, a series of in a thread, and we retweeted it. And there's a 1917 water cooled in one of those photographs, and then you have an M2 Browning pops up. and the Japanese have Type 92 machine guns, which I assume the Filipino army must have captured and had on hand.
Yeah, got them left over from the campaigns there. So for me this week, I really liked seeing American HBT, the herringbone twill uniforms. They're almost like the US version of our battle dress denims that the Home Guard wear and troops wear when they're working. They look very sort of iconic for that theatre. They weren't exclusively worn in the Pacific. You see them all over the American combat experience. You see them all over, really. But they look nice, and they are distressed. They're grimy. It's not like something where when we watched When Trumpets Fade, every man looked the same. They look like off the peg sort of uniform. But this one, I like the little touches. So that the chap I forget his name, but he's with the mule. He's cut his sleeves off, and he's wearing like a long sleeved shirt underneath. I think you've got the platoon leader. He's rolled his sleeves up. You got the old sweat sergeant. He's fully buttoned up, short sleeves down. He feels like an old campaigner from Guadalcanal or something.
Well, he was an actual veteran, so maybe that's maybe he knew best.
Exactly. And I like that. It's really nice. The webbing's good. The only one small immersion break. It's very small. If you're not looking for it, you won't see it. On the march at the end, when it says, "Oh, and they did win the battle," and they're marching, there's a guy at the front with an M1 carbine, but it's got a 30-round clip in it, and that's wrong. Okay. It's not wrong for World War II. They used them really at the end of a few prototype ones.
They all have the bayonet lug as well, though, don't they?
Yeah, they do.
And that was a late war thing.
It was only a very small thing. I'll let them off because it's probably what the Philippines have got. It doesn't matter. But the one thing that I did sort of not laugh at, because it's not wrong per se, but when the British troops come in.
Oh yeah, we've got to talk about that.
They're in. I want to say they're in jungle KDs. I mean, I don't think they are.
They are.
They might be. Yeah,
it's the right colour.
The right colour. They've got felt hats on. Well,
they've got Mark II helmets on
as well. Yeah,
there's a couple with the slouch hats. Yeah,
I mean 1908 webbing. It's not wrong. I've seen it used. I think the Australians used it. In the
Ennis Malley was saying that on Twitter when I mentioned this, because I was watching the film and I thought, well, that's so interesting because we've had that intro that is at pains to mention the British involvement to the point where it talks about all the different parts of the UK,
and then it looks like the costume the
one English person that talks is quite clearly Australian trying to do a British accent.
Does this predate Mary Poppins? Because it's like
no, this is nothing compared to Dick Van Dyke's accent. Dick Van Dyke's accent is so much better than this chap's.
The raid in Spain.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's very bad. But they're one of them. I did you notice, Matt? One of them's got a number 4 Lee Enfield.
He does. Yeah, he does.
Just one of them. The rest of them have got M1 Garans. But
I know. Yeah, it's a bit odd.
It was nice to see them. Like it was nice.
I think the officer's got like a leather Webley holster as well.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it's
it's a weird mishmash of kit. That's. But
yet again, they look like they've been through the mill as well. That there is that level of detail. You got men with arms in slings.
All of them seem to be wounded.
Yeah, they didn't look in very good state. I didn't think they were going to get 100 yards down the road.
And they're the point unit. Christ,
that's the British spirit. They'll fight for anything.
They're being led by Britain's only Osloan officer.
Oslo. That's brilliant.
So yeah, why not?
Oh, fantastic! But I thought for overall for what early 60s movie that feels very much like a black and white 1950s combat film, it does a good job. I think there's nothing in there that's too immersion breaking or anything like that. It's
no. I've watched far worse films in terms of that kind of thing. I mean, there's some low budget Korean War movies where they're just not. I began watching that one you mentioned to me the other day, Combat Squad.
Oh my god!
Yeah. And my, that's bad.
We'll get onto that one in the coming weeks.
Yeah, I'm sure that'll be one mentioned at some point.
So
does that bring us on to favourite scenes?
I think it does.
Hello there. Sorry to interrupt. I wanted to let you know that you can now join our supporting cast over on Patreon. As thanks for your support, you'll be able to help us pick films, submit questions for guests, have first pick on brand new and exclusive merch, and much more. Thank you for your support. Now back to the show.
So, Gavin, as you're our guest, what's your favourite scene from the film?
I like the scene with the mule skinner halfway up the mountain, and when he takes the mules. The mules, obviously, as they were, as the mountain itself isn't very realistic, but that sort of scenario happened, and so he takes some of the load from the mule, and he's, they want to shoot the mule, but he says no, and it just shows you that bond that existed, and it really did exist between, and the men had great affection, I think, for the mules. But there was a very funny story told to me by, actually more than one. I think it became a bit of a Marauders a unit fable, that going up the mountain, one of the mules fell into a ravine, and they were trying to get it out. And the catchphrase of or sort of a running joke among the Marauders was, "You volunteered too," or no, "Well, you volunteered for this." So when they were grumbling to each other, they would say, "Well, you volunteered too," and so when they're trying to pull this mule out of the ravine, and a Marauder said, "Get up, you son of a bitch! You volunteered too." And that sort of joke to the, I think that sort of shows you that they saw the mules as one of them, as part of them, part of the unit. That they were all in this together, really, to use that good old cliche. And so I think that was represented by this scene, where the
I think they even paraphrase saying that at some point in another scene, don't they?
Yeah, I think it became a bit. Whether it was actually said or it's become a bit of an urban myth, I don't know, but it was certainly told to me by more than one veteran. But I think it just shows you, that's right, when the sergeant wants to shoot the mule, and the mule skinner says no, and that judge, I think that was quite illustrative of a connection there was between man and beast in that situation.
And when they have that argument about eating the mule too, and it's like, and the guy, I think it's Ty comes in and goes, "Look, you won't eat mule. You're not going to eat mule meat until I tell you." And that's very telling to me. It's not, and also it really clutches on the heartstrings, because I haven't seen this movie in absolutely years. So when he readied that Thompson at the mule, I was like, "No, you can't do that. Not the mule." It's like, please think rationally here. It's not. And I like afterwards he's wearing the mule's little wicker hat. That's really cute. It's a nice little touch. Fuller knew how to, make us care. That's one of the great things about this film. At times, it does do a good job of that. Matt, favorite scene?
I'm not sure I have one specifically. Not that there aren't great scenes throughout the film. I really do like the choreography of that second battle sequence, though, where they're moving through Wallaboom, and they're fighting their way through. It's a really interesting thing to depict a firefight in. It's like the foundations of a fuel silo, and the Japanese are running around inside, and they're trying to fight their way through. There's lots of great camera work where it's tracking shots of the Japanese, and then at the end of that, there's a really nice little sequence where Ty Harding's character Stock is surveying the battlefield. And it goes into this nice overhead shot of looking down on him as he's walking above the battlefield on top of the foundations, and he's stepping from foundation to foundation, looking down at the devastation below. The Japanese have been routed, and he's lost a lot of men. And it's just a really nice shot. It's illustrative. It shows the toll of the battle.
It's very Sam Fuller does Gone with the Wind there, with all the men on the floor. Did you notice that? It almost strikes me as the exact same.
Not
shot.
Not quite the same.
High.
Not quite the same height as Gone with the Wind, but I know what you mean.
It's echoing.
I like that, and I like a lot of the sequences where the weight of command is shown. So you get that not only with Stock's character and not only with Merrill's character, but with Stock's character. He's a new platoon officer, and he's struggling with writing letters home. And there's a scene where he talks. It's definitely not a favorite scene, but he talks about his relationship with Merril, and Merril wrote a letter home to his wife because Stock didn't have anyone, for him to write home to him about. And those little bits that are filtered in throughout the film are really interesting because they have an interesting relationship, as inaccurate as it may be, and it's not based in anything in particular. I don't believe. I didn't see that anyway. But yeah, I really like that sequence in Wallaboom where they fight their way through that fuel yard, through the railhead, and the contemplative little sequence after it. I thought that was quite well done.
That is powerful. Yeah. I don't have a favourite scene either. Not because I don't think the movie's strong enough to have one. I just couldn't pick one personally. But I do. One thing I will talk about is I really like Fuller's sense of scale because he's got a lot of men on screen at any one given time, and they're all in kit. They all have weapons, and it really adds something to the movie. Whether it is accurate or not is another matter with the types of battles that they fought. But it is very good scale. It's something that I think Fuller does well. But I also really like the parts where it seems that some sequences could almost be ripped out of stock footage. I really like the start of the movie that uses that little sort of cut up section. It's like a square within the scene. It's not full blown. It's like a little square in the middle of the scene at the start. And the guys, it talks about the Marauders, and it's black and white, and it comes into color. And you think, it's our movie now.
Yeah,
and it's
Chandler's walking ahead of a column, isn't he? And then it just fades into color, and the ratio expands, and that's how it begins.
It's a really strong transition, and I like when movies do that with stock footage, using it in a clever way rather than just cutting it in to save money because you can't afford battleships or something.
It's a classic contextual introduction to the film.
It's really
but
good,
done in a quite a competent way. And
I like the parts where at the start, because one thing this movie does as well, I know it only sometimes concentrates on the platoon of maybe 3 or 4 chaps, but it does show you the three of a lot of men on a track. It does show you that. And at the start, when they're trying to get to cross the river, and there's men with mules, and there's men trying to carry over packs and things, that's really nice because I did a video on my channel about the mechanical mule little truck thing they had after the war, and there's footage in that documentary that I used of I think it was the Marauders guys with mules going through, and it could be shot, it could be just that colorized. It is really nice to see it. So I think probably it's that level of sort of detail as well. But there's one little section I will mention as well before we go on to the Patreon questions. I like the part where it's wrong to say because it's not the right emotion. But they're going up the ridge there, and a chap loses his footing and falls, and you hear a scream, and you don't hear anything else, and there's no thud or anything like that. So it's not played. It's not. I thought it was going to be played.
They didn't throw a Wilhelm scream on it.
No, exactly. Yeah, it's not played like that. And the chaps look over, and they keep going, and it's really powerful. I think, okay, these lads have been through the mill now. That guy falling isn't the worst thing they've seen. It really shows a little bit more of their psychological barrier falling. I like that.
It comes back to what Gavin was saying earlier. It shows that dogged, resilience of them pushing through really horrible circumstances in a really difficult environment.
Hello, I'm Al Murray, and you're listening to Fighting on Film, the world's #1 war film podcast.
So I think that brings us on to our Patreon questions. So we've got 2 questions this week for Gavin, and they are a couple of crackers. So Tom McCall asks, what is the best veteran story or experience Gavin has had, whether it's being told a hitherto unknown boy's own story or being shown some incredible wartime souvenir or medal collection?
You sent that question in, Tom, did you say?
Tom McCall, yes.
Yeah. Oh, great question, Tom. I'm assuming it's not just confined to the Marauders. Is that correct? It's just...
No, it was more of a general one, I think. Yeah.
Well, Tom, it was great question, and I spent about an hour this afternoon thinking about it because I've been privileged to have many unforgettable encounters with veterans, be they British, American, French, Canadians. But I think probably it's, and I mentioned this actually in a tweet, in a thread on Sunday, because on Sunday, July the 24th, on July the 24th, 2005, Fraser McCluskey died, and he was a Padre to one SAS in the war and spent 3 months behind the lines in the Vaughan on an outstanding guerrilla campaign for which he was awarded an MC. And I, in 2003, there's my ticket. I've kept it. It's such a special day. It was a service of dedication for the Roll of Honour of the SAS Regiment, which was at St Columba's Church in SW1 London. And it was the old and the bold. So there were, 30 or 40 wartime SAS veterans were there for this service of dedication. And Fraser McCluskey, who was then in his early 90s, wasn't well enough to come down. So they had a video link in the church, and he spoke from his home in Edinburgh. And I was there as a plus one to a chap, Bob Lowson, who was in 1SS. So I was sat among the wartime veterans. And as soon as Fraser McCluskey came on the screen, you could just feel the respect and the reverence that they felt for this man. And he gave the address. And then at the end of the service, they sung Lily Marlene, which was the regimental song of 1SAS as well as the Afrika Korps. And it was just, the hairs on the back of your neck stood up. And it was just such a privilege to be, just to feel this camaraderie that existed 60 years later. And then afterwards, we got in a couple of coaches to, there's a curry lunch that laid on for everyone at the Imperial College London. And that was just, again, in a different context, but they were eating their curries, drinking their beers, stories were being swapped, they were Mickey taking, and the sort of years fell away from them. And they were back to being young men in the SAS in 1942, 43, etc., 44. And it was just to witness that was just something so special. And so that's probably for me the something that I will treasure. I'll certainly never forget it, and I treasure it. And when I think of it, it just makes me so gratified that I was able just to be part of that for a short time.
That's incredible. Well, thank you for sharing that. And thanks for Tom for the questions. It was an absolute corker.
Yeah, really good question, that was.
And the second question today comes from Andrew CG. He asks, and this one's a bit more in depth, and it is a Marauders related question. He asks, the role of the Chinese X-Force in supporting the attack on Myitkyina is overlooked in the film. What did the veterans have to say about their fighting capabilities and the support to the Marauders? And what did they think of Stilwell, a prickly and political general who demanded so much of them?
Good question.
Again,
I know.
Was that Andrew?
Andrew, yes.
Yeah, Andrew, a really intelligent question there. Firstly, they had a respect for the Chinese. After Wallaboom, they had a brief fraternization, and obviously a bit hard with the language barrier. But the Marauders I spoke to said, we admired the Chinese. They were very good soldiers. One gripe, however, was that they refused to eat the K rations. They Stilwell had flown in a lot of fresh food. So nice canned corned beef, onions, cucumbers, rice. So the Marauders weren't too happy about that. They were munching their K rations, and these boys were on there having this tucking into this lovely fresh food. But no, in general, and of course the Japanese too. We mentioned Sam Wilson. I asked Sam Wilson about that, and he said, "Well, I'd been told beforehand that they were a very good fighting soldier, and so it proved." And And it was Sam Wilson who also, I think, I'm going to quote from you, because it's very interesting about Stilwell. He was not liked at the end of a campaign. He was hated. In fact, there's a quote somewhere I saw, which wasn't told to me, but it's in the literature, of one marauder saying, if I could get that son of a bitch in my sights, I would shoot him. That's how I hate him, because they just thought, and they were right, really, that he lied to them, that he'd broken more than one promise. But I asked Sam Wilson, what was your opinion of General Stilwell? And he said, and I quote, Stilwell was one of the greatest corps commanders in World War II, with enormous tactical skills. But he had an impossible job because, aside from being in charge of the CBI, the China, Burma, India, he was deputy commander of Southeast Asia Command and chief of staff to nationalist Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek. He was stretched so thin, he could not give adequate attention to any one of these jobs. Ultimate in diplomacy would have been required for a man holding these various jobs at the same time, and he was not a diplomat. So as far as I'm concerned, he failed.
Interesting.
Very. Yeah.
I think the film's depiction of him is very simplified.
Very.
Because, he comes into that hut with Merril and he makes the big ask, and Merril's reluctant. And, he turns to him and says, well, Frank, my big worry is 1 million Japanese hooking up with the Germans. And I don't know. I think that simplifies the situation in China, Burma, India massively, doesn't it, really? I mean, I don't think the Japanese ever intended to physically hook up with the Germans.
No,
I think
the Germans ever did either. It was
Just another thing about Stilwell is that very much he wanted to seize Myitkyina, and this is what really the Marauders realised after they'd seized Myitkyina, that it was about the glory for Stilwell. And it was a quote from him, this will burn the limeys up. He was an Anglophobe. He didn't like the limeys, the British.
I got that from War of Empires. Read that. You're like, Stilwell didn't like us very much, does he?
And so when they seized the airstrip at Myitkyina on May the 17th, they received an order of the day from Mountbatten, in which he really praised their feat and said it was a wonderful achievement. But they received nothing from Stilwell. And
shocking,
Hunter, actually, a week later, when Stilwell returned to the airstrip, and I think it was May the 25th, and Hunter very courageously personally handed him a letter in which he lambasted his leadership and his neglect of the Marauders and the broken promises. And Stilwell read it in silence and then looked up at Hunter and said, this is a strong letter. And Hunter said, I feel strongly. Very courageous. He was a man of high principle, Charles Hunter, and ultimately it cost him his job. His job, and to an extent his reputation. And he was really airbrushed out of the scene. But again, Sam Wilson,
literally in the film.
Well, yeah.
So Sam Wilson said, Merril was a brilliant staff officer with creative ideas. Hunter was the executor of ideas, the man of action. And so this Merril's Marauders, great bit of alliteration.
Yeah.
But it was really, should have been Hunter's Marauders.
Right. It still sounds good, doesn't it?
Yeah,
it does. So I think, they're fabulous questions. Thanks to our patrons for those. Yeah, very, very
actually,
good.
Actually, I think it's quite interesting that the zero mention of the Chinese in the film.
Yes.
For obvious reasons. Communist China.
Probably at the time, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But there's zero mention of that, and they're just as important within that theatre as anyone else.
It seems only now that they're getting a bit of more recognition. There's a couple of books that have come out lately about their war, big documentary series a few years ago. I remember
massive misunderstanding of
Yeah, of course.
In the West,
interesting, boys, because when we chatted a couple of months ago about the attack, what was it? Attack
Force Z. Yeah.
It was such an outstanding film. I've already forgotten it. That was in the early 70s, wasn't it? With
Yes.
a young Mel Gibson.
1980, I think. Yeah.
That's right. So late 70s. So nearly 20 years later. And of course, Mao was dead. And Chinese, because we were talked about this, because the Chinese are portrayed
Chinese relations had thawed.
That's it,
yeah.
Exactly. So of course, in the early 60s, they were real boom, boom. I mean, even Russia, Khrushchev found Mao a bit hardcore in the early 60s. So
wasn't it in 62 that they actually invaded India? The Sino-India War was in 62. So that's that's
not going to help.
Backdrop for it, isn't it? Really?
Yeah. That brings us on to final thoughts this week. Gavin, your final thoughts on Merrill's Marauders?
I think for its time, it's a decent film. I think it's. I can understand why the veterans would be a little bit upset, because there's only 3 real characters and 2 of them weren't really liked by the Marauders, Merril and Stillwell. But I think actually, as we've said, it's quite authentic in terms of kit, of weapons, etc., of uniforms, and they've done a reasonable. They've stuck quite closely to the chronologically. The terrain, as we said, isn't very accurate. But no, I think I would sort of probably give it about a 6.5 out of 10.
Yeah.
Okay.
I kind of agree there. I've got in my notes that a good but not a great film. So I think what it is, because Fuller is so sort of held up within the industry itself, you got people like Tarantino and Scorsese, they hold him up as influences for their work. I always expect a lot more than I get out of Fuller movies, I think. Although it's good and it's got great set pieces, and I think it shoots its shot too early with the set pieces. I wish it had shown the men at least going in to Myitkyina and then fading out. That might have been nice, because it's the whole point that they're out there, surely. But I feel like it can't make its mind up at its core, whether it's about Merril and his inner battle with whether he's going to make it with his health, and if he's going to get these men there. You get that from it, but then I almost feel like it's at its strongest when you're showing the strain on the troops. So somewhere I just feel a bit more attention should have been paid to one or the other, and you can't do both justice, and it tries to, and I just don't think it, because at the end when Merril has his heart attack, it's quite one and done. He holds his chest and he goes down. I'm thinking, well, I would have cared a lot more if you'd have shown me a lot more what Merril was going under, because sometimes it's a little bit underplayed, and maybe he was understated as a person, and that's how he's portrayed in the movie. I don't know, but yeah, I just wanted a little bit more. I think that's my one through line, and I think the 6.5 out of 10. We don't rate them, but I think that is fair. Fuller's a good director. Don't get me wrong. I think he just gets it over the line, but it's not gonna. It's just wanted more. What about you, Matt?
I'm coming off what you said there, Rob. I think I agree. When you think about it, there's not many films that try and combine a classic squad level war movie with command decisions in an organic way.
Yes.
And the film really does try and do that. And there's a number of scenes where it's pure exposition, and it's often with the doctor, and someone asks him, and there's a discussion, and he says, well, Stock used to be his sergeant when he was a major, and that's how they're linked, and they care about one another. And then there's little exposition scenes that talk about Stock was wounded, and he writes home to his wife, Merril's wife, and that kind of stuff. And they try and meld this relationship, and then they show the breakdown of that. And I like the aspect where it breaks down, and Stock finally says, you don't care about these men, do you? And Merril's response is, you have to hurt men. When you're in command, sometimes you have to hurt men, and sometimes they're your own men. It's an interesting dynamic, and I like that they've attempted to do it. And as you say, it doesn't always work.
No,
that's
that sounds more like dialogue out of 12 O'Clock High. It really does.
Yeah, there's a weightiness to some of these scenes, and then
And it's a shame because then it is. Yeah, I was about to say that. Yeah,
it's lost elsewhere. And the scale is good. The scale's really good. I've seen this film dozens of times. I've watched it since I was a kid, and I like it. I when I came to rewatch it for this show, though, when I was a little bit more critical, it wasn't as good as I remembered. It's been perhaps a year or so, 2 years since I've seen it, and I've probably just caught the back half of it on TV at some point. But sat down, watched it again, and it's good. But I was like, well, there's no representation of Chinese forces. There's no representation of Japanese Americans, as we've mentioned. And then some of the exposition feels clunky. And then the bit where Stock helps the young lady that's got a shrapnel wound in her leg, unnecessary. Didn't feel that was really necessary. I think they just got that in because she was another fairly well-known Filipino actor. And I think that she was in there because they were filming locally. And maybe it was, I don't know, something the studio had agreed on to film there. It just felt unnecessary.
Well, I think fighting on film successfully killed another childhood classic of yours, Matt, hasn't it?
Yeah, God damn it. Why did I start this podcast? Just one after another. No, I enjoy the film. I do enjoy it. And I think we talked about the kit, and I like how the film shows that progression of exhaustedness. And Objective Burma actually does it as well. It shows the distressing of the uniforms. The men grow facial hair. They're tired. They're exhausted. They break down psychologically. And I like that they portray that because, as Gavin's, eloquently explained, the hardships they faced were huge.
Yeah.
Some of the worst of the war. And the film tries to get that across, but I obviously geographical constraints. They can't show the elephant grass that Gavin mentioned, and the thick bamboo forests, the freezing mountains. But it still does a fairly good job. But I think it ticks the box in the end of, I really want to find out more about this unit, Merrill's Marauders, that campaign. And I think I encourage everyone now to.
I was going to say,
Gavin, do you mind? I was about to plug for you.
Can I just say something, boys? I've forgotten. I've got after about a 5-year campaign on May the 25th this year. I was honoured to be part of it. It was a virtual Congressional Gold Medal ceremony. The Marauders got their Congressional Gold Medal after a lengthy campaign.
Wow.
I always felt that there was this sort of slow burning resentment that they hadn't been, because of a nasty way things had ended, they hadn't been properly recognised. So they got this campaign. Nancy Pelosi was the Master of Ceremonies. And a couple of Marauders now actually were present online and participated. There's 2 Marauders left. So 3,000 originally volunteered in August, September 43, and there's 2 left. Gabriel Kinney, who's 101, and Russ Hamler, who's 98. So there we go. So that's going to be quite a poignant moment when the last survivor passes into history, and we sort of lose that living link with the Marauders, because they were an exceptional bunch. And I think just my final word on this, and you've touched on this, both of you, is that they again, another facet that I think they do convey is the sort of a rather unorthodox nature of the unit. So the characters, ethnicity-wise, there's a real hodgepodge of a very good Native American sniper, quite a few of Mexican origin, etc., German, English, Irish, all sorts. And also with the clothes, and they sort of, that sort of rather maverick feel, which was true, and they were an exceptional unit, and it's been really enjoyable to talk about them and just hopefully shed a bit more light on them.
Yeah, they're fantastic. And of course, if you want to learn more, pick up Gavin's book wherever you can.
As I was trying to say.
Yes.
Before I rudely interrupted you.
Oh, no, not at all. It's fascinating.
No, definitely do. I'm so glad you could join us for this, Gavin, because as I said earlier, as soon as we knew we were going to be covering it, I said to Rob, we need to get Gavin on for it because he can do it, the justice that we want to do it. and the actual campaign itself, and give us all that context that really brings.
And it's always fascinating to me, like whenever we find like what the veterans felt after the fact, and it's always these, you don't get it as much now. Maybe you get it. Maybe we'll get it with Iraq and Afghanistan movies going forward. But it's only like 10, 15 years after, and that like it's like a blink of time, isn't it? And I always it's like when we did Objective Burma, I loved reading how guys felt so aggrieved at how they were portrayed. And then obviously you get it with the Merrils guys. I'm just really pleased you've been able to come on and share that with us.
Well, it's a pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
No, it's always our pleasure. And yeah, of course, if you haven't said it already, please do search out all of Gavin's books. They're all fantastic. His recent Attack Force C one was very good. I had to leaf through it before I had to send it away to the lucky winner last time. But as always, thanks for listening to Fighting on Film. You can find us on all the socials these days. I think we're on TikTok, Twitter, Facebook. You can find all of our back catalogue at fightingonfilm.com. Who knows, you'll have a FOF binge, maybe find some of your favourites there and see what we think of them. Gavin, yet again, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And we'll catch you next week.
Thanks, Gavin.
Thanks, boys.
Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Bye-bye.